you've sent me an outline
right?
with all the major,
Well, not all of them.
but
We're
some major ones.
Yeah, I've got some extras that I added.
So
Tell me when we're on camera.
what's that?
Are we on
Oh
camera
yeah,
now?
we're on camera.
Oh, okay. Well, you got a lot of cutting to do then.
It's fine. It's all good. Um, so I think fair statement to say that you've had a very full life.
I've had a what?
A very full life.
Yes, I have. I can't believe I've had it, but I have. And that's what we're here today to talk about, right?
That's what
Yeah.
we're here to take a deep dive into. So, if we could start, let's start with work life.
Work.
Right.
It's a bad name.
Work life.
Yeah, right. So you want me to talk about my advertising?
Well, what I'd like you to talk about is, I would say you've had a successful career.
Yes, I have. But I think basically when you're looking for how I got into things
Well, what I'm looking for is
from the work standpoint.
from a work standpoint that goes beyond work. I like to look at threads. So if you look at what made it possible for you to be successful.
Well, that's the puzzle because when I started, I wasn't much of a student, and it was during World War II, and there wasn't much of an education going on in those days. And when I would get a C, we had somebody who worked with us, or for us, and she used to bake me a cake. So it became a C student because I'd bring home the report card and then she'd say, "Here's the cake, you did good." Anyway, that labeled me. And so I was uh, pretty much, I think part of it was my father was away at the war. My mother was working in a military base selling stuff in the PX. And we were just, there independently and all that. And so I wasn't interested in school particularly. Just as a social thing, I liked that. That kind of had a thread until one day when my homeroom teacher said to me in graduating high school, "Save your parents the money. Do not go to college." And I said, "Really?" So right there gave me the incentive to go to college, which I had, but only because my peers were going. So one day I went over to a friend's house and he was looking at a University of Florida catalog. And I said, "Well, what are you doing?" He says, "Picking out classes to the University of Florida." I said, "I think I'll go to the University of Florida." And so I came home, told my parents, and my father said, "Who's going to pay for it?" I said, "I guess you are." And he said, "Well, I'll tell you what, you got 6 months. In 6 months, if you don't make your grades, you're out." So, and he said, "Stay away from fast girls and booze." So I got on the train, went to the University of Florida, got off the train. The fraternity came over and said, "So what do you want, Joel? We'll do anything for you." And I said, "I'd like a date and a party." and that's what I got. So in 6 months, it was lucky that I went to this particular fraternity. In those days, there were Jewish fraternities and non-Jewish fraternities. So this was a Jewish fraternity. But they studied every day. For the Frenchman class, had to study, if you were pledging, 3 hours a day, every afternoon with a tutor for 5 days a week. And that really totally taught me how to study. And I had pretty much good success, except that I was majoring in accounting, and that was not where I should have been. So we made a deal with the accounting department that if I never showed up at an accounting class again, they'd take my points and send it over to the marketing department. I had no idea what the marketing department was. So I went to summer school, took 3 classes. I only needed 2. And the first was marketing, and it was at 7:50 in the morning. I figured, well, I'll get rid of that if I don't need it. Needless to say, the second one was advertising, and the third one was salesmanship. So on the fact that I could make a decision about marketing and then get rid of it, I ended up falling in love with it. So I got an A in the class, I got a B in advertising, and I got a C in salesmanship, which was this CRIP course. But all those things stuck with me. And so I was graduating college, and an alumni came from, appeared one day at a alumni group, and they said, "What are you doing when you get out, Joel?" And I said, "Gee, I don't know." He said, "Well, don't you have a resume?" And I said, "No." He says, "Well, let me show you how to do a resume." So we do a resume. He said, "Now you have to have an interest." And so he said, "Why don't you join the advertising fraternity? And that way, when you get out, I'll be able to hire you because I own an ad agency." So I said, "You got a deal." So that's what I did. So when I graduated, I went to him and I said, "Here I am." And he says, "I can't afford you." I said, "How could you not afford me? We haven't even talked money." He says, "I can't afford you." I said, "I'll tell you what, I'll work free." He says, "I can't afford you, but I'll get you a job." So he got me a job as a mail boy in an advertising agency that had all the accoutrements and the bigger Miami, Florida advertising community. They had better accounts. And so I worked there for about 6 months. I was hired as a trainee and become an account executive, assistant account executive. And the production department guy that was my boss hated me because he wanted a high school graduate, not a college graduate. And so I'd go out on deliveries, and I'd go to the newspaper, and I'd ask for show me around the newspaper. Art, show me around, tell me about your art. So eventually they came to the head guy and said, "We want to fire Joel." So they can't find me. And they finally find me, and I walk in, and before they could tell me what they were going to do, I said, "I want a raise, and I want a promotion." And I said, "And now you have a cancer in this company called the production department, and the guy is on my back, and he's constantly harassing me. And other than that, this is a fantastic place to work. I'd love to stay here." They could not believe what I'd said. So they gave me 6 months. And I said, "Who am I going to report to?" The same guy that was on my back. I said, "Could I have a week? I'll get back to you." And I was on a advertising board in Miami, and a guy was trying to hire me. And so I went with him, and I was there maybe 6 months. And he comes in, and I was making $65 a week. And I had, and my father had bought me a car. And so he comes in and he says, "Joel, I got bad news for you." "What's that?" "We have to let you go." I said, "Why is that?" He said, "Well, the guy that owns the agency is leaving, and he doesn't want to pay your way during the time that he's still here. So can I see him?" He said, "Sure." So I go in, and I said, "What's your problem?" And he tells me. And I said, "Okay, I'll work for nothing." So "What do you mean you work for nothing?" I said, "Just give me 50% of the amount of income you get from the advertising, 15%. And he had tears in his eyes. And he says, no one's ever, ever, ever done that in all the years I've been in advertising. You're going to go a long way. So that was one of the early stories. And then I just decided I didn't know what I was doing, and I had to go to New York to find out. And I had lunch with a friend, and I said, you just graduated college. What are you doing for a living? And he says, well, first thing I'm doing is leaving Miami. I said, you're leaving Miami? He said, where are you going? He said, New York. I said, I'll go to New York with you. So it leads me to the what ifs. So a lot of those decisions were made with, which turned out to be gutsy, because in those days, Miami was just a dream place to live. All my relatives and friends thought I was crazy. My fraternity brothers, they thought I was nuts. And my mother gave me $150, and I went to New York with a friend who his mother was getting rid of their cottage in New Jersey, and they were going to move to Florida. But I could stay with him. So he drove me there. I stayed with him. And so I started looking for jobs. In those days, Jewish guys could not be account executives in 90% of the agencies. So I went to an interview with a really major Gentile agency. And the guy's, got a rubber nose and a red face and head of human resources. And he says, Joel, if you had the better economic background and better school living background, I'd hire you. I said, no, why don't you finish the sentence? You can't hire a Jew. He turned beet red, and I said, so I'll see you. Anyway, I ended up at an agency that was owned by Jewish people, but they were trying to go big time. And that was Gray Advertising. And it was home for me. And I stayed there for 5 years, and I rose through the ranks. I think I was there 6 months. Everybody else at Gray started as a trainee from a big major school, an Ivy League school. I came from the University of Florida. So I got in the traffic department. And I was in the traffic department, and I had 14 accounts that I had to monitor the flow of work. And the Westinghouse people really liked me. And so I went to them and said, look, I have an ad. It's got Westinghouse on it. I walk into a guy's office for GE, and he says, why are you here? And I said, I'm getting a lot of flack. I said, so if you want me, I've got to get rid of all these accounts and get out of the traffic department. So they promoted me, and I became an assistant there. So that's basically, for some reason, I had this amazing feeling about why you tell me why I should work for you. I'll give you one example of that. There was this really, I would say elderly, now I can't say elderly, an older man who had a lot of accounts. They had Benrus watches, and they had the Hat Corporation of America, and he had all these suits and stuff like that, retail stuff. And I go in for an interview at Gray, and he's looking out the window and not talking to me. And he turns around and he spins around and he says, why should I hire you? And I said, because I know everything about the dealerships in TV appliances. And you just got a TV account. And you don't know a damn thing about the dealers. And I do, because my father was a dealer and I worked for him for years. And that's what I can bring to the table. He said, wow, no one's ever talked to me that way before. So it was something, and I don't know where it came from, but it stayed with me. So I kind of bullied my way through. You know, it was a wonderful time to be in New York. I mean, I thought I died and gone to heaven. I mean, it was the golden age of beginning of TV advertising. I ended up with the Macy's account, which had put them in radio and TV, and they for 100 years were just newspapers. But when it snowed, I had to call every radio station in New York to tell them to run snow tires. So they had to know where I was 7 days a week. And that became a problem for me after a while. But then I just decided I had enough of that type of advertising. I wanted to go into packaged goods. Let's take a break. I'm talking too much.
All right. Well, I have a few questions.
Yep. Why are you here?
No. No, we know why you're here. At key moments, you did some really gutsy things.
I what?
You did some very gutsy.
Right.
The way you spoke to people.
Yeah.
It could have gotten you in a lot of trouble.
Well, in those days, nobody talked. When you went in with a resume and you sat there and they drilled you, there was no, you were really nothing to them, whoever it was.
Right.
And if you didn't have the right credentials, you were gone. I don't know where that came from, but I used it to my benefit all the way through my advertising career.
I would love to take a look at that. That's such a huge piece.
It is. Yeah. There was an ad. I can tell you more when we're on camera, I guess.
Well, we are on camera.
Oh.
But this is something I'm really curious about. But that's a very, it's a subtle but a very huge piece.
Well, at the time, based on the times and what was going on how to get a job, that was unheard of. And but I thought, why would it be a one-way conversation? So there was an ad in New York Times that ran every week from a group that was an employment placement group. And they ran an ad called The Counterfeit Executive. And they said, how do you know whether or not the person you're talking to is for real? And so that sprung in my mind, you have to be realistic, you have to be real. And so I did a lot of gutsy things that way, and it worked even when I had my own agency. I would I'd do the homework when I was pitching a new piece of business, and then I'd go in and they'd say, so why should we hire you? I'd say, well, first of all, I think one was a restaurant chain. And I said, first of all, I looked at your figures and I've talked to your staff and you have major problems. Your managers are turning over and no one seems to know what the customer counts are and all this. And they said, whoa, no one's ever told us that before. So that was the approach I used. And it kind of worked, I guess. So the idea I was at a big agency, Doyle Dane Bernbach, which I think we talked about, the most creative agency that ever existed at that time. And they pioneered in the creative world. And so they were not prepared for me because all of them walked on water. They were all creatives. And I just took that attitude of, hey, marketing's important. You need to hear what I'm having to say, and I can't play your game. Because they say to you, well, how long have you been here? Well, I've just got here 6 months ago. I've been here for 12 years, and we're the best agency in the country. What do you have to offer? I'd say, no, no, no. Let's turn that around. What do you have to offer me? And it worked. It was like magic. And so I used that, and I don't know where it came from. I mean, I didn't earn it, that's for sure. Well, I don't know about that, you know. I realized somewhere along the line I was smart, and which really happened in my senior year of college, where an oxygen bubble suddenly went off, and I realized I can do this. But in the meantime, there were embarrassing moments. Like, for example, I was dating this girl, and we went out in college. It was the girl that I was introduced to. I dated her for 3 years. So now we're graduated. I'm in the mailroom of an ad agency, and I'm back at homecoming. And I'm sitting in a restaurant, diner, and she comes in with her new husband. And, you know, it was Old Home Week. And so she says, my husband owns all of the pharmacies in Tampa, Florida. And we own a motel together. And I'm doing special ed. I have a PhD, or getting a PhD. So what do you do, Joel? And I said, I'm a mail boy in an advertising agency. And they said, oh. And I said, no, bro, I have a good future. This is going to be, I really am. This is a place for me. You know, I'm going to do it, right? Yeah, I've went through a lot of that humiliation part, but I can handle it. And I'll never forget that. That was, yeah. And then as I rose through the ranks, you know, I just kept doing what I was doing, you know. But I have a creative bent. And that was also another thing I don't know where it came from. And so when I had my own agency, and I hired a lot of great creative people, I'd get a client, I'd go in and I'd give them the strategy and all the stuff that I thought they needed. And the creative department would come back without the ad that I was hoping to get. And that's when I would say, look, I just gave you the headline. You have to respect the fact that I brought the client in and I own the agency. So when I ask you to do something, at least consider it. So they would come back with their campaign and my campaign. And then we go down to the client and pitch it. And my campaigns won 9 out of 10 times. So I wasn't the most popular guy with my creative department. But I don't know where that came from.
Well, let's take a look, shall we?
Hmm?
I said, shall we take a look?
Yeah, sure.
Yeah. So somehow you had the capacity and the ability to read the room and read the play and know where to push and how to push and most importantly how to get results.
Right.
Because that was like when you were talking about early on, when some of the things you said to your superiors were pretty strong.
Yes.
But it worked to your favor. It actually, you know, people were taken aback, but it worked out great. So somehow you had that knowing of okay, this is a perilous situation potentially, but you knew how to navigate it.
I think a word is risk. I was willing to take a risk. And that followed me going from Miami to New York, and then from New York to California. And those were big moves. Most people thought I was crazy. And And again, I look back, and I had the great ability to take risks, and most people avoid risks.
Now, what was it because you had extra courage, or you on some level you knew it was a risk worth taking, and you had some way of gauging that?
No, I took a negative and made it into a positive. So if I was at an agency or I had a client, I'll give you one example. At Dual Dane, I was on Bristol Myers account, which had Clairol hair coloring. And I figured out one day, this is what happened. So the advertising director of Bristol Myers and I are walking toward a presentation in the agency. And the guy says to me, you know, Joel, I don't understand who you are. I just don't get you. And I'm thinking, wait a minute, this is the biggest guy I know. He doesn't know what I'm doing. He doesn't know what I stand for or who I am, basically. And then I started thinking, you know, I put down on paper how many people are responsible for thinking that Joel is good. And it came to 19 people had power over me. And that's when I decided to go into small agency business and control the business. And that was an epiphany. And that's what I did. And by doing that, I carved out a career, basically that spanned 30 more years. And I didn't want anyone, invisible person, having a judgment on me. And so that's exactly what I did. So then I started as director of a Chicago-based agency in New York. Had beautiful offices on 6th Avenue in the Time Life building. And but I wasn't paid very much. And I brought in all kinds of accounts. And there was a guy there that was undermining what I was doing. And he was the executive VP of the agency in Chicago. He was the creative director there. They kicked him out and put him in New York. And he spent most of his time trying to undermine what I was doing. I mean, it's hard to believe. So it's Christmas time, and I get a call from the owner. His name was Al Rosenthal. And he says, so, Joel, what are you doing for your staff for Christmas? I said, what does that mean? He says, well, you know, you should go to Saks Fifth Avenue and bring back gifts and all that. I said, okay, I'll do that, Al. I don't know it's necessary, but yeah, I'll do that. So I went and I did that. So then I find out that the executive VP is undermining what I'm doing, hates my guts, and so I quit. And Al Rosenthal comes, don't do it. You just lost your wife, and you don't know what you're doing. You have kids. He says, I don't want you to do that. I said, Al, let's have a meeting. So he flew in, and he says, so what's your problem? I said, in there. Let's have the meeting in his office. So we go into Neil's office, and we sit down, and he says, so what's your problem? I said, well, first of all, Al, let me tell you about Neil, your executive VP. He hates your guts. He can't stand you. He steals from you, and he undermines my work. And Al says, well, gee, Joel, are you sure about that? I said, yeah, I'm sure. Meanwhile, this guy's sitting there looking. So I said, Al, I'll give you a test. I said, are you giving Neil a raise? He said, yes. I said, are you giving Neil a bonus? He says, yes. I said, what are you giving me? Nothing. I said, done. He says, oh my God, well, who's going to tell the accounts? I said, be my guest. I said, but I got one request. I need 3 months. And it's what we agreed to 5 years ago. That if anything was wrong, I would have 3 months. He says, if I said it, you got it. And so that was my break from the agency that sent me that. And then after that, ended up going to California. But there's a nice story attached to that too.